Hi, my name is Zachary Von Baron, and this is Gender and Resistance, Chicanas within the Chicano and Feminist movements, prepared for an intro to Chicanx Latinx Histories at the Claremont Colleges. In order to understand what we'll be discussing today, it's important to know what was the Chicano movement. In short, the Chicano movement was a social and political movement starting in the 1960s with the purpose of resisting the oppression faced by Mexican Americans in the United States. It was led by young Mexican Americans and gets its name from the word Chicano, which had previously been used as a negative way of describing Mexican Americans. This word was reclaimed and given a new meaning by young Chicano activists who began to use it to show pride for their heritage. At the same time that the Chicano movement was beginning, the women's rights movement was also starting. Also known as the second wave of feminism, this movement had the purpose of creating equality for women in all areas of life. This included equality in the family, in work environments, and in access to birth control and abortion. During the height of the movement, activists were able to ensure greater legal protections for women in the workplace, in addition to opening up many job sectors that women had not worked in before. The largest things that came out of this were passing of Title IX in 1972 and the ruling in Roe v. Wade in 1973. Title IX made discrimination on the basis of sex illegal at any publicly funded place of higher education, and the Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the U.S. Having now described a little bit of the background of the movements going on at that time, we can start to talk about the role of Chicanas in the feminist and Chicano movements. So, when we study these two movements, there's a tendency to look at them as independent. However, when we look at the role of Chicanas, we see that there's overlap. Being both Mexican American and female, Chicanas face discrimination not only because of their heritage, but also due to sexism, not only from society as a whole, but also within the Chicano community and movement. For the Chicana to achieve true liberation, both Chicano and female liberation had to be achieved. However, through the early 1970s, a rift between Chicana activists and feminism made that difficult. This rift existed for two main reasons. The first was the construction of the, quote, Ideal Chicana, we'll get into that later, which in a way disguised oppression as empowerment. And the second was that the feminist movement mainly catered to white middle-class women and excluded non-white voices from feminist dialogue. In order to understand more about this rift, we're going to be looking at a primary document that shows just what I was talking about, as well as illustrating the two main reasons behind this rift. It's a speech given by Chicana activist Martha Cotera in 1972, titled Feminism as We See It. Cotera was born in 1939 and was and continues to be a prominent Chicana activist and was highly involved within La Raza Unida. In this speech, she's addressing the Texas Women's Political Caucus to discuss cooperation between Chicana activists and other groups for female empowerment. Just in the opening remarks, we can already start to see the rift between Chicana activism and mainstream feminism at the time. Cotera, speaking as a representative Chicana activist, says that they do want to cooperate with white women. However, this is because, quote, we are completely aware that the condition, if you want to call it that, of Anglo women can't help but affect us, since Anglo women teach our children and provide most of the input for all media in the society. In other words, if you're screwed, we're screwed. Therefore, help you we must, end quote. In other words, the reason behind any cooperation is not necessarily based in their shared struggle as women, but rather because Cotera believes that the oppression of white women will impact Chicanas. She goes on to emphasize this cooperation is not because of sexism faced by Chicanas per se, and says that while white women think that women of color need to be liberated from sexism within their own communities, that, quote, in terms of personal status, the minority woman is usually ahead. She'll usually enjoy a much stronger position at home and have a stronger base from which to spring into action than a kept woman, end quote. Cotera uses the Chicano movement as an example of this, saying that, quote, in our grassroots movement, una mujer con huevos is respected and does assume posts of responsibility, end quote. On a surface level, she makes a convincing argument. However, Chicana feminist scholars today would now say that this is not necessarily true. Instead, it perfectly illustrates the gender dynamics within the Chicano movement at that time. And these dynamics were precisely why Chicana feminism, which came later, was something that was crucial. In her speech, Cotera paints a picture of Chicana autonomy and empowerment, but when we look more closely at the history behind the figure of the strong, or, quote, ideal Chicana, we can see its origins in patriarchy. So now we've touched on this a couple times, but let's get into it. What is the, quote, ideal Chicana? So when we say that the portrayal of Chicanas as powerful is based in patriarchal constructions, we're not saying that Chicanas did not have powerful and important roles within the Chicano movement, nor that they were prevented from having it. What we are saying, however, is that these roles and the role of the Chicana as a whole was constructed in a way that kind of undermined the necessity of Chicana feminism by obscuring and sort of hiding underlying issues of sexism and gender inequality within the movement. Within Mexican American culture as a whole at that time, many gender dynamics were based on the family unit. And that meant that the woman was both a provider and the backbone of the family, yet still beneath the man in terms of absolute power. And this dynamic was present in the early Chicano movement due to its emphasis on reclaiming tradition and cultural pride. Unfortunately, part of this traditional approach meant that Chicana women were constructed in a way that was dictated by traditional patriarchal male values. The result of this was the Chicano movement's creation of the, quote, Ideal Chicana. This was a very specific construction of womanhood, and one that sociologist Alma Garcia says, quote, glorified Chicanas as strong, long-suffering women who had endured and kept Chicano culture and family intact. Nonetheless, because of the patriarchal basis of this construction, despite the fact that it painted women as strong, it painted them as strong still under the power of men. And what this meant was for Chicanas in the movement that even if they were strong and their strength was valued and idealized, they were still put oftentimes in supporting roles as opposed to leadership positions, and their voices were not heard. So ultimately, they realized that in order to achieve true Chicana liberation, issues of gender and power within the Chicano movement had to be addressed. However, as we can see in Cotera's opening remarks, this awareness was not widespread within the movement in the early 70s and came later on in the late 70s and 80s. Now that we've gotten a bit of an understanding about sort of the rift because of the construction of the Ideal Chicana, we're turning our attention to the other thing, which is the sort of racism that was present within mainstream white feminism. And Cotera talks about this in the rest of her speech. Her speech is about the need for cooperation between groups, a reluctant one albeit, but, cooperation nonetheless. So when she's explaining this, she brings up a few potential issues. The largest of which, she says, is an attitude that will create major problems, and that is a, quote, basic racism of the mind. From there, she goes on to ask the audience and answer her own question, and she asks, what is stronger, racism or sexism? I believe racism, unquote. And what she's getting at here is that there is a divide between white feminism and all other types of non-white female activism due to greater in-group cohesion along racial lines and gender lines. And when we say cohesion, we're referring to the fact that many women, white women, in the feminist movement identify themselves as being fundamentally white before they're female. And that means that in times of racism, their racism wins out over their experiences of sexism that they might share with women of color. And the result of this is that rift. They're not able to identify with or fully be working together collaboratively with women of color. And we can see this manifested when Cotera continues to speak, and in the rest of her speech she does express a lot of suspicion for the women's movement, and especially about how many white women have been silent when it comes to issues concerning communities of color, and have only been interested in cooperating with Chicana feminists and other feminists of color when it was to their own benefit. So in other words, that suspicion is that the interest of the white feminist in the Chicana woman lies not in a true belief in liberation for all women, but opportunism. And according to Cotera, this is essentially stemming from the way that white supremacy and systems of oppression have exploited relationships with people of color continuously in the past several hundred years. So now looking at Cotera's work, I think we can start to understand all the ways that gender and race intersect in the complex history of the Chicano and feminist movements. At the time she was writing, there was still a rift between the two because of the things that we've just seen. However, fortunately, change came in the late 1970s and 80s. Marginalized within their movement for racial equality and excluded from the movement for female liberation, Chicana activists went and created a new movement, which was the Chicana feminist movement. By looking at the past, Chicanx scholars and activists were able to create new ideas and theories about feminism and its role in the fight for racial equality, and because of that, a new movement was born. And this is something that ultimately speaks to the power of history and why it's important for us to explore and understand it. History informs us about our past, which can tell us about our present, and from the present, we have the power to shape the future. And so to understand how movements have come to be, who was involved, and what has changed because of it, is to have the ability to continue learning, exploring, and hopefully affect further change in our own lives.